Hello viewers, today we will look at the relationship between gender and environment. The word environment is often associated with two distinct connotations, one of environment as nature and the other of environment as lived surroundings. However, today we shall examine how these two connotations often collapse into each other when we start looking at the daily life experiences of people. Naturally occurring components like water, air, land, etc., what we refer usually to as natural resources, form a major part of the environment. While agriculture requires land for cultivation, it also requires favorable climatic conditions, adequate water supply, and allied occupations like poultry, animal husbandry, collection of forest produce, etc., also requires that there be an availability and access to land, forests and water. Urban environments often depend on the availability of land, on the availability of water and other fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, petroleum products for their sustenance. Thus we see that human beings need a favorable habitable environment for their survival. Now if we look at examine the issue of women and environment, we see that women's work is often linked to the environment through subsistence agriculture, domestic chores that women are required to do, and hired work like sowing and weeding. And we see that much of this work which involves women is made harder, much more tedious and time consuming through environmental degradation. Women, particularly in the rural areas of the third world, owing to their roles and responsibilities in agriculture, animal husbandry and other livelihood related issues, and because of their specific roles and responsibilities in the household and the community, play a major role in the maintenance, management of natural resources, whether it's soil, water, forests or energy. As a result of this daily sustained interaction with natural surroundings, these women also tend to have a profound knowledge of plants, animals and ecological processes around them. Now, before going into the linkages between gender and environment, we are going to take a very brief historical overview of how the issue of environment came up. Now, the issue of environment came up in coincidence with the changes about thinking about development itself. We know that in the beginning, when development was first thought of, development was always understood in terms of man's ability to control nature, to harness nature for his or her own benefit. However, serious rethinking of this present paradigm of development, which focused on industrialization, urbanization and consumption, led to the coming up of the issue of environment. Rising levels of pollution, depleting natural resources and an overall environmental degradation proved to be the catalyst for bringing visibility to the issue, both on the international level and in the context of India. Now, when for the first time environment started to be thought about, it was thought that the poor are the most polluting. It was often argued that the poor reproduce more, therefore their numbers are increasing, and their increasing numbers are what are putting pressures on the world's natural resources. The UN Stockholm Conference, however, changed this perception. It was pointed out in this conference that it is in fact the developed, richer countries of the world whose smaller populations consume many more natural resources, and thus in fact it is the richer countries which are putting more pressure on the environment. In tandem with this thinking, it was also realized that those people, communities and nations who are the most poor or the most undervalued are also most likely to be exposed to environmental hazards, are most likely to pay the price, as to say, of environmental hazards. And therefore, this entire rethinking on the process of development itself led to visibility to the issue of environment on the international level. In the 1970s, in the Indian context as well, we saw the rise of many environmental movements like the Silent Valley, the protest against the Silent Valley project, or we have the very famous Chipko movement coming up. Now, it's interesting to note that environmental movements that came up in India in the 1970s came up basically as movements of the rural poor. Now, this was not because the urban working classes or even the urban middle classes were not affected by environmental degradation, but the effect on their lives of environmental degradation was majorly in terms of the quality of life that they could enjoy, which was at the level of consumption. However, if we look at the rural poor, we see that they rose in tandem in environmental movements, because their conditions and processes of production, their very processes of livelihood were being threatened because of environmental degradation. Now, if you look at the movements that came up in the 70s in India, we also realize another very important point that we need to take into consideration when we look at gender and environment, that the impact of environmental degradation on communities is not uniform. Which is to say that if a particular community is facing environmental degradation in terms of depletion of forest cover or irregular land usage, then all the members of the community are not equally affected by it, but that the impact of environmental degradation is in fact mediated through caste, class and gender. Thus, people who are better off, males from certain castes, are more likely to survive even in the face of environmental degradation, whereas groups which are lesser off anyways in the social hierarchy face the impact of environmental degradation much more severely. And therefore, we see that environmental movements were in fact initiated by the most poor women, or from by women from lower castes, for whom this depletion of the village commons, the depletion of forests had a direct adverse impact on their daily livelihood and sustenance. Now, there are various aspects of environmental degradation that impact women. There is land, there is water, livelihoods, shelter, fuel, fodder and firewood. Now, we are going to look at each of these in some detail one by one. Now, first, if you look at the issue of land, we have to realize that agricultural lands, common forests and other common property resources like village commons play an extremely important role in the economy of an agrarian country like India. These resources are important not only because they provide food, fodder, firewood, fruits, vegetables and timber for building houses, but also because they are important in maintaining environmental balance through ensuring the regeneration of groundwater, prevention of soil erosion and air pollution, etc. Now, though these village commons are in that sense used by all, we have to realize that in most rural households, and for that matter in most households, it is the women who are responsible for collection and storage of food, fuel, water and wood. Now, even though these resources are commonly used by all, they are of utmost importance to the most poor households who otherwise do not have access to private property. So, village commons provide the sort of a bulwark against complete impoverishment for these families, and that too those families which are living on the edge of subsistence itself. And specifically, as we have pointed out, since women are the major collectors and storers of food, the women of these households in particular are dependent on these common property resources the most. Now, if you look at the issue of food security, which becomes extremely important when we are looking at the issue of land in terms of gender and environment, then we see that for food security, land and availability of cultivable land is the most important resource. Now, most of the world's women do not control land resources. Some studies say that less than 1% of all property in the world is controlled and owned by women. Though, if we examine agriculture, even in a country like India, we see that increasingly all the labor that is provided for agriculture, whether it is in terms of peasants or in terms of agricultural laborers who work on other people's farms, majority of this labor is in fact provided by women. However, they have absolutely no control over land, either through property or through actual control. In tandem with this, we need to realize that the sexual division of labor in households works in such a way that women are considered, though it is the man that we often talk of in terms of being the breadwinner, it is the woman of the household who is considered responsible for ensuring that food reaches all. Okay. So, therefore, what happens is that food security in that sense becomes a woman's issue, but land, which is the most important resource for ensuring food security, is not in the control of women. Therefore, what this does is increases the burden of work on women. The other important issue to look at in terms of land, specifically in the Indian context, would be the entire issue of the Green Revolution, which has been touted as a very successful experiment as far as food security is concerned. Now, we need to again look at the experience of the Green Revolution for women. What we see is that in North India, where mechanization was introduced on a large scale, women were thrown out of agricultural labor, but their labor in allied activities like processing of food, animal husbandry, etc. went up. In South India, where mechanization was introduced on a more limited scale, we see that it was in fact only men's jobs which were mechanized, which meant that women's labor continued to be used in intensive amounts on land, and also that since men were thrown out of agriculture, the burden on women increased. Thus, what we see is that in the context of the Green Revolution, there was an intensification of the burden of women's work. And now there has been very well documented proof of the kind of ill effects on environment that the Green Revolution technology itself had, in terms of salination of the soil, in terms of waterlogging, in terms of deteriorating quality of soil. Now all of this impacts agricultural produce and therefore impacts women, who are considered to be the primary food providers of the household. If we are to look now at the issue of water, we see that since the UN Water Conference of 1977 and the subsequent launch of the water decade from 1981 to 1990, there has been a growing awareness of water as a critical issue in development. Water is now acknowledged as being the very basis of life, and in fact it is now considered the major developmental task of every state to see to it that every citizen has access to adequate and safe water supply. But often what happens is that women's roles in the collection of water, and therefore their specialist knowledge of water resources, as also their skills of coping up when water resources are scarce, is often ignored while considering developmental policies. Now, with the issue of water, we often think of water only in terms of drinking water. What we need to, however, realize that water is needed not only for the purposes of drinking, but also for other household jobs like cooking, cleaning, washing, etc., as also for purposes of irrigation and industry. And we see that whether it is at the level of the household or at the level of the community, collection and storage of water for all of these purposes is considered to be the special responsibility of women. Now, environmental degradation and changing land usage patterns, basically which are aimed at producing commercial benefits, can cause water shortages for many people and often create associated water pollution problems elsewhere. Common examples of this include the overusage of groundwater for industrialization, leading to shortage of drinking water for communities around. Now, with the issue of water and gender, one thing that we need to definitely always remember, that it is the intersection between gender, caste and class which determines women's access to water resources, and therefore the severity of their hardships and the amount of time required to meet the water needs of the household. Thus, we see that in poorer households, both in rural and in urban areas, women spend considerable amount of time trying to get potable and safe water for their families. In fact, water is such a critical issue that along the axis of caste and gender, we often see conflicts over the issue of water. So, there have been instances, for instance, from the drought situations in Maharashtra, where Dalit women have often been beaten up for trying to access wells which have been reserved for the upper caste. Or we even see examples where the upper caste have purified wells which have erstwhile been used by the lower caste in order to claim them during periods of water scarcity. Thus, it is not just women per se, but the intersection between gender, caste and class which determines women's access to water resources, and therefore it is the poorest women from the lower castes, and especially women who are living in urban slums or in rural households, who are most affected by a crisis in water supply. Moving on from the issue of water, if we look at the issue of forests, now forests are often the first thing that comes to our mind when we talk of issues of environment, and forests are extremely essential to sustain not just the world ecology but also human life itself. Now, forests protect watersheds and they regulate water flows through the absorption of rains and evaporation. They also maintain ecological balance for a regular and clean supply of water and help in protecting agricultural lands, especially those which are downstream. Through their root system and foliage, forests also play an essential role in soil protection and prevention of soil erosion. Thus, forests are in fact integrated. In fact, in most rural surroundings, we see that forests are not a standalone system which can be exploited for commercial purposes, but forests form an integral part, as it were, of the entire agricultural system, the entire agricultural complex. Now, women are often, especially women in rural areas and tribal areas bordering forests, they are the main gatherers of forest produce. Women again due to their continued interaction with forests, are not only dependent on the forest for many of their needs of the household, whether it's needs of everyday fuel, fodder for their animals, timber for building houses, or helping out in supplementary food in terms of berries, roots, etc. But they also develop knowledge about the many uses of the of various trees, including medicinal uses of these plants. Now, because women are the main gatherers of fuel, fodder and water, it is primarily their working day, which anyways in rural households extends to anywhere between 10 to 12 hours. It is mainly their working day which gets lengthened with the depletion and reduced access to forests, waters and soils. Now, the decline in gathered items from forests and from village commons has a direct impact on their incomes. Many women are dependent on forest produce, what they gather from forests or from village commons, and sell in the market to supplement family income, or in fact even as main income earners of the family. Now, when forests get depleted, when common property resources are eroded, this has a direct impact on the amount of gather that women can collect, and therefore on their incomes in a very direct way. In addition, what we also see is that the extra time that is needed by women to collect either firewood or fuel or fodder reduces the time available for women to engage with crop production or to engage with cultivation, and therefore can adversely impact crop incomes, especially where we see that men have already out-migrated and women, especially in hill communities, are the major cultivators. So, when the time spent on gathering these forest produce or gathering fodder or gathering fuel goes up, or even gathering water goes up, that the time that they can spend on cultivation goes down, and that has a direct adverse impact on crop production and therefore on household incomes. Loss of firewoods also means a scarcity of firewood, which means more time is spent on collecting fuel, and also has meant, and many studies have shown this, that it also results in changes in the cooking habits, where we see that many times women either cook food that requires lesser time to cook, or they cook fewer number of times, having an impact on the nutrition of the household. And again, since households do not distribute the available nutrition or the available equally to all its members, but structure them through hierarchies of gender, it is women and girl children who are most adversely impacted through a change in cooking habits. Since the erosion of forests and deforestation, as we've already said, has affected the material basis of women's knowledge about medicinal and healing properties of various trees. Now, once forests are, and we have largely seen this, that multi-variety diverse forests are being eroded, and even where afforestation efforts have been taken up, mostly we see the plantation of monocultures, which means that only a single kind of plant which is commercially viable is planted to take over areas which had a very diverse forest. Now, what this means is that the material basis on which women's knowledge about medicinal properties of plants stands, that very material basis gets eroded, and this has also therefore led to an erosion of women's traditional knowledge as well. So, we have many studies showing us that the elder women of households, which is the grandmothers and people of those generations, have a knowledge of medicinal plants that is lost through generations, because those plants are not available anymore for them to be utilized. So far, we have been looking at issues of water and land and forests, but all of these come together to sort of have an impact on livelihoods and sustenance possibilities of many groups, and particularly of the women of those groups. Now, if we are to look at how environmental degradation has an impact on livelihoods, we will take a very small example of the fishing communities of Tamil Nadu. Now, the fishing communities of Tamil Nadu have been dependent on the sea and have been fishing in their traditional ways for many years. The sexual division of labor within the community works in such a way that though men go to the sea to actually catch the fish, it is the women of the household who not only market the fish in the market, but also are involved in a whole lot of allied activities like maintenance of nets, making new nets, preserving the extra catch that might be there, processing fish which are likely to spoil easily, so on and so forth. So, they play a major part in the entire economy of the fishing community. Now, a major threat sort of to this this traditional way of living for the fishing community came in the form of trawlers. Trawlers are huge boats which have the ability to almost scrape the sea bottom for produce, and of course that means that they produce much larger amounts of catch than individual fishing boats can. But the fisher people of Tamil Nadu rose in tandem against the trawlers for very many reasons. One, they said that trawlers, the kind of produce that trawlers could catch at one point in time, meant that trawlers could also afford to dump this fish in the market at much lower rates, having a direct impact on the income of the fisher community. The other thing that they also pointed out was that these trawlers were majorly owned by people who were not locals, and therefore there was the kind of intensive capitalist investment that was required for trawlers was not possible for the community to do. Also, trawlers required specialized skills which were market oriented, and therefore it also meant that people from within the fishing community also did not gain employment on the trawlers. But aside from these livelihood needs, what the movement brought out was the fact that trawlers were very hazardous to the ecosystem of the ocean. What they pointed out was that when trawlers indiscriminately fished and when they sort of used these drag nets to almost scrape the ocean bottom, they were also destroying breeding grounds of fish. Many times they were also picking up those organisms and those other species which were not commercially viable, but which were extremely important for the maintenance of the ocean ecosystem. And therefore what they said was that the trawlers were not only a hazard or a danger to the livelihood of the fishing community itself, they were also a hazard to the entire ecosystem, the environment of the ocean itself. And therefore we see that environmental degradation has a sort of a direct impact on the livelihoods of communities like the fishermen, who are dependent on natural resources for their production processes. And thus we see that in the issue of livelihoods, in fact a major movement being launched in terms of the Tamil Nadu Fish Workers Collective, where women were at the forefront, because women, as we've already mentioned, were considered to be the ones who had to meet all the basic needs of the family. They were also the ones who had a lot of interest in maintaining traditional ways of life, because as we've said, the sexual division of labor in the fishing community worked in such a way that women were in fact the marketers of the fish. They were also very directly with the daily production processes of fishing. And they also pointed out that reduced incomes for the household also meant reduced nutrition, reduced healthcare, reduced education for women themselves. Thus we see that the environmental degradation not only affects water availability, land usage patterns, or degradation of forests, it also has a very direct impact on livelihoods and sustenance possibilities for very many groups, and especially for the women of those groups. Now, so far we have been looking at rural environments. We need to also remember at the same time that more and more people are migrating to urban areas in search of employment and better standards of living. Thus, urban environments and issues pertaining to the urban environment and degradation of the urban environment also need to be considered from a gender perspective. Now, when we look at the issues of urban environment, we first need to understand that, as we've already mentioned, it is the poor who are the most adversely impacted by any sort of an environmental degradation. Thus, when we look at the issues of the urban poor, we need to remember that women are disproportionately represented among the poor, and that female-headed households are among the poorest in urban environments. We also need to remember that the poorest in an urban environment suffer the most from the effects of environmental degradation and pollution. Thus, within urban environments, women are disproportionately affected by issues of urban environment. Now, which are the major issues that concern people in urban environments, especially the urban poor? The lack of basic infrastructure means that women not only labor much more, but also take greater risks in ensuring a supply of basic resources for their family. For example, water. Most urban slums do not have a provision of safe drinking water. So, we see that women are not only laboring more, but they are also taking greater risks to ensure that water is available not only for, as we said, purposes of drinking, but also cleaning, washing, etc. The general environment of non-hygiene also means that women take up the greater burden for ensuring that families' health is not endangered. Lack of sanitation facilities and toilets also affects women's health, and having to use open areas means they are vulnerable to all sorts of sexual violence. Now, those who live in urban settlements of this sort, the poor settlements of this sort, face three kinds of environmental degradation. On the one hand, they constantly, since most of these are located on the borders of industrial areas, they constantly face the danger of industrial pollution, and the Bhopal gas tragedy is an excellent example of that. They also suffer from effects of minimal and inadequate basic services and from the deterioration of the urban hinterland on the whole. In addition to women's responsibilities at home, which do affect them specifically when it comes to urban households, we also see that many women, especially poor women in urban areas, are employed in polluting and hazardous working conditions, especially in unorganized sector jobs. So therefore, women are at the receiving end of environmental degradation, not only at the level of the household and the community, but also as workers in hazardous working conditions. Now, looking at all of this, this talk of gender and environment, we will see that women have been major participants, initiators and leaders of movements that have come up against environmental degradation all over the world. The Chipko movement in India, the Green Belt movement in Kenya are very well known examples of this. Now, this has led to a lot of thinking about what is the relationship between women and environment, and why is it that we see women at the forefront, as it were, of environmental movements, whether they are there as peasants, whether they are there as forest collectors, whether they are there as fish workers. We see that at different levels women seem to be at the forefront of environmental movements, and there has been a lot of thinking that has gone into why this is so. Now, one strand of thinking about women and environment, which is often called the eco-feminist approach, sort of traces the commonalities between exploitation of women by men on the one hand and the exploitation of nature by men. So, certain strands of the eco-feminist approach posit a sort of an umbilical relationship or sort of an inherent natural kind of a relationship between women and nature, because they say that both women and nature reproduce, they procreate, and therefore they have an inherent sort of a relationship with nature. And because of this umbilical cord, as it were, with nature, women are more likely to nurture and protect nature. So, as it were, women therefore are at the forefront of environmental movements because women share a certain kind of innate nature, innate being with nature, and therefore they are more likely to intuitively be part of environment movements for against environmental degradation. Others have argued, however, that we need to locate women's resistance to environmental degradation and their participation in all sorts of ecological and environmental movements, not in the inherent nature of women and not therefore in the fact that they are reproducers, but in their material relationship with natural surroundings. What this means is that because of the kind of social roles and responsibilities that are expected from women, whether it is at the level of households where we have seen that they are supposed to be the major providers of food, water and other basic necessities for the family, at the level of community also they are expected to sort of keep sustenance of the community in their view. They are more dependent on natural resources for survival and subsistence, and it is this material sort of a basis, this material sort of a relationship that women have with nature that makes them more interested in the conservation of the environment. Thus, what people argue is that it is not all women, all women as it were, who are likely to involve in movements to protect environment, but those whose material basis and production processes is likely to be affected by it. An excellent example to sort of look at this would be the Chipko movement, and something that a lot of us might be familiar with, where the women of the Chipko movement came out and sort of hugged trees so that trees would not be used for commercial purposes, because they understood the forests as being providers of fuel, as being providers of fodder, as being providers of food, and also as those which ensure that air, water, soil, all of that is kept clean. Thus, these people try and say that we need to locate women's sort of participation in environmental movements in their material relationship with their natural surroundings. Thus, we see that the issue of gender and environment is a rather complex one, because different women are located differently and therefore interact with their natural surroundings in different ways. What we need to, however, remember in the Indian context is that those groups which are most likely to be affected by environmental degradation are those whose production processes are dependent on the environment, and therefore are also the ones who are more likely to articulate a sort of an environmentalist feeling or an environmentalist sentiment. Thank you.